Risk practitioners often talk about risk appetite, and I've made my position fairly clear on that with my writing and in fact in previous videos. But sometimes there's, I think, a better way of thinking about um, what is an acceptable level of risk, and that is the acceptable level of actual loss. So, tell you a story. When I was the head of internal audit for the Tosco Corporation, we owned the Circle K business, which was about 6,000 convenience stores and gas stations around the United States. There are convenience, there's Circle K stores outside the United States, but those are actually independent companies. They are, I think, they might have been franchised and then sold off. So Circle K business that we owned was just within the United States, primarily in the South, Florida and such, and all the way over to California, especially Southern California. And there was a separate group of internal auditors that we actually audited this group. They were the store auditors. They would go into the stores and actually do an inventory. They would make sure that the reporting was accurate. And it was fairly straightforward 2 or 3 day audit of each store. And one of the things that we were concerned about was a level of what was called shrink. Shrink being a very nice way of talking about theft and loss. It could be customers, it could be employees who are stealing product from the shelves. It could also be vendors that were reporting that, and these are the actual people delivering, that they were delivering maybe 10 products and actually only putting 9 on the shelf and recording 10, or maybe taking one as they left. But either way, all of this is shrink. Now, there's a certain level of research that had been done, because I looked into this to understand, and it was around 1% shrink was deemed acceptable. Acceptable because investing and doing things to limit the level of shrink would actually, to bring it down to 1%, less than 1%, would actually cost more than was being saved through reduced levels of shrink. So the return on the investment of trying to address that risk of shrink didn't justify. So it was necessary to accept a 1.1% level of shrink. So my team, they would look at the controls that would be monitoring the level of shrink, looking at the ability of the company to respond if it started to move up past 1%, up to 1.1, 1.2, and that was very successful. Now, the reason I'm bringing this up is, first of all, because I think that's sometimes it's a better way of running the business. For example, in the oil industry, we had a certain level of acceptable shrink in the stored product due to evaporation. It was just known to happen, so a certain level of loss was acceptable. But now in the news this week, we have seen that Target, the retail store company, is closing operations, closing stores in, I think it's 4 different states, because their level of shrink has gone from 1.4 to 1.6%. And they they are considering that as too high to be able to consistently make the kind of return that they're looking for in their stores. And this is following on from Whole Foods and other companies moving out of, say, downtown San Francisco because of the level of shoplifting or shrink. So understanding that acceptable level of loss, that acceptable level of bad debt, that acceptable level of whatever it is, I think, very important and perhaps needs to be considered perhaps even more significantly than any thought of risk. Because yes, there may be a level of risk that it'll be higher, but frankly, from a business point of view, day-to-day running of an organization, just monitoring actual levels may be sufficient. But it does mean that we have to recognize that there is that acceptable level of loss in some areas, in some parts, in some businesses, in some parts of the business. And that's whether we're in management, in risk management, or in internal audit. And this is something that sometimes we don't have a good grasp on, which is understanding, yes, there is a problem, there is a loss, but what would it take in terms of investment to reduce that further? And sometimes the return on investment doesn't justify that. And so it's better to have an acceptable level of loss, acceptable level of shrink, whatever it is. Now, with that risk appetite, I don't know. I don't think so. I think it's a little bit different than this concept of an acceptable level of loss in terms of probability. But anyway, I'll leave that with you to think about how that applies in your own business, whether there's an acceptable level of employees leaving the company, whether there's an acceptable level of late payment on receivables, that kind of thing. And whether management has made that clear and whether management is now monitoring that and the risk of it going beyond acceptable levels. Hope this is useful for you. If you like these, please subscribe to the video channel. Thanks.